Welcome to Chapter 3 of Law in Australian Society, which is all about politics and the media. In this chapter, you'll learn about how politicians are elected to Parliament, the different political parties in Australia, the importance of executive government, the relationship between government and the media, and the importance of the media as a check on government power. And the point of going through all this material is to learn about how laws are made. So laws are not just some objectively determined rules, there's a whole process behind enacting them that involves political parties, interest groups, the media, human rights organisations, and a whole range of other interests. At the federal level in Australia and in most of the states, there are two houses of Parliament, and we refer to these as the lower and the upper house, which has to do with the process for enacting bills. So the lower house at the federal Parliament is called the House of Representatives. It has 150 seats traditionally, although in the 2019 election they added one more electorate for 151. Now the political party which wins the majority of seats at a federal election becomes the government of the day, and the leader of that party is the Prime Minister. In the Senate, the political party which wins the majority of seats is usually not the same political party that has control of the lower house. And this is designed as an important accountability mechanism because laws can't pass through Parliament easily if the Senate involves negotiation between political parties. In the Senate, elections are also staggered, so senators are elected for 6-year terms, not 3-year terms as in the House. In the Senate, elections are also staggered so that senators sit for 6-year terms and half the Senate is elected each time. This can get quite complicated thinking about Senate voting, but it's also designed to contribute to a more stable upper house compared to the lower house, which changes according to the government of the day. However, the Senate is also less stable than the House of Representatives in the sense that the voting procedures it relies upon allows a greater opportunity for minor parties and independents to get a seat. There are two voting systems used in federal elections. First is preferential voting, which is used in the House of Representatives. Now, this relies on us electing members from individual electorates based on a majority of the vote. Proportional voting is used in the Senate. This is where people are elected to Parliament on the basis of a quota system, which is usually about 14%. It's this voting system which allows minor parties and independents to have a greater opportunity to win a seat in Parliament because it doesn't require them to win a 50% majority of the vote. Most people elected to Parliament are members of a political party. So political parties are just organisations with a particular set of ideas and beliefs that put forward their members for election to Parliament. In Australia, there are two major political parties, and you will have heard of these, the Labor and Liberal parties. The Liberal Party traditionally forms a coalition with the National Party, so you might hear of the Liberal National Coalition or just the coalition government. In addition to people from these political parties, there's also many other minor parties and independents. So the Greens is an obvious example of a minor party which is having greater influence in today's parliaments. There are many other independent candidates, and some might only be elected for one 6-year term in the Senate, and others might be elected for 2, 3 or more. When thinking about how laws are enacted in Parliament, and you remember the build process from Chapter 1, it's important to recognise the role of the executive government. So the executive government, in theory, is the branch of government that administers or uses laws in practice. However, in Australia, senior members of the executive government, known as ministers, also sit in Parliament. So there's a blurring of the separation of powers, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Senior ministers like the Attorney General, the Treasurer, the Minister for Immigration, these all sit together as Cabinet. And Cabinet is just a meeting of the senior members of government. And it's largely responsible for determining government policy and introducing new laws into Parliament. The executive government, though, is much broader than this. It does start with the Queen as our head of state, and it goes down through ministers and parliamentary secretaries to everybody working in a government department. This chapter also considers the role of the media. So you'll know that the media is a group of broadcasting and publishing companies that communicate information to the general public. So this includes TV stations and newspapers, which are increasingly online. And also now we'd probably include social media in that, or at least the major media companies have a social media presence. The media plays such an important role because it can report on new laws directly, so it can explain when new laws are introduced to Parliament and what different political parties think about those laws. But it also reports on the events leading up to the introduction of new laws. And that might be a murder or one-punch attack or terrorist attack, or changes in moral values like the same-sex marriage laws and all the developments along the way. But the media doesn't just simply report on what's happening, it also plays a really important role in holding government accountable. And it's often called the fourth estate because of this, as if it's another arm of government. This can involve media reporting on government wrongdoing in some way, or criticising the laws and critiquing them, getting expert advice from academics or other organisations, and putting all that information together to inform the public about which laws are being enacted and what the impact of those laws will be. In order for media to play this role, there's a press gallery comprising some 250 journalists and other media staff who work actually in Parliament House, and that gives them direct access to politicians. And finally, the chapter talks about maintaining freedom of the press and the importance of maintaining a diversity of media sources. This is really important to our democracy because we need to seek information out from different sources to be able to critically analyse what's going on. So the chapter discusses the political influence that different media organisations can have and why this is important to our modern democracy. So to reiterate the main points from this chapter, the seats in both houses of Parliament are occupied by members of political parties. A different voting system in the Senate, which is called proportional voting and relies on a quota system, gives a greater opportunity for minor parties and independent candidates to be elected. Ministers play a really important role in introducing new laws. Ministers are just senior members of government who've been given responsibility over different policy areas, which are called portfolios. And finally, the media plays a crucial role in reporting on government activity and holding politicians to account. Some discussion questions that you might talk about in your lecture or tutorial group. Firstly, would you describe yourself as having left-wing or right-wing views? These concepts are discussed in the chapter. What about your friends or family? So what kinds of political views do you think you and your friends and family have? Secondly, do you think that minor parties and independents should be able to hold the balance of power, which is the deciding vote in the Senate? Whereas the lower house has traditionally been in the power of the Labour or the Liberal parties, the Senate involves a more complex mix. Thirdly, how does the Senate act as an important check on government power? And here you can think about proportional voting and the process for enacting a bill that we talked about in Chapter 1. What is the executive branch of government and why is it important to lawmaking in Australia? You might think of some recent examples of political activity where ministers have introduced new laws into Parliament. And finally, to think about social media, which Australian politicians can you find on Twitter and Facebook? How many followers do they have? Are they using different services now to what they did in the past? And how do their profiles compare to overseas political leaders like the US President and the British Prime Minister?